What if you yelled at your wife or you put her into a corner just because you felt disrespected by her? People do this all the time with their children, but we barely bat an eye at it. In fact, some people would call that good parenting. Is this right? Today, we're going to be exploring the moral philosophy that I've laid out in previous videos as applied to the situation of parenting. We're going to talk about how we ought to view the parent-child relationship through the lens of voluntarism, through the lens of authenticity. We're going to lay out the inherent power disparity and dynamics in the parent-child relationship. We're going to talk about what the ethical ideal parenting situation looks like, how we can deal with the imperfections of being human in that relationship, and the different kinds of failure states, both authoritarian parenting and permissive parenting, that come as a deviation from this ethical ideal. And we're going to be doing this because consequences of how we parent children, how we relate ourselves to children, can be incredibly consequential for not only the child's life itself, but for our society as a whole. Oftentimes, how we treat children is how they will treat their fellow man in the future. And oftentimes, it determines the kind of society that is going to be advocated for in the future. If we want a society that is voluntary, if we want a world in which everybody can be authentic in a universal way, then raising children in a voluntary, authentic way is going to be one of the best tools that we have for actually changing the world. And besides that, it's something which is incredibly important to the well-being of the child themselves. So I'm not going to waste any more time. We're going to get right into it here in talking about the inherent power disparity that exists between the parent and child. Now, a lot of this is obvious upon reflection, but it isn't often made explicit to our minds. And I think just refreshing ourselves with this kind of information is going to give us a good context for how we are viewing the ethical situation of the parent-child relationship in the rest of this video. Now, what's the power dynamic between the parent and the child? Well, in the first place, we have the fact that the child does not choose the parent, but the parent chooses the child. Of course, the parent, by one means or another, chooses to have a child, chooses to bring them to term, and therefore takes responsibility for the child's well-being, for their survival, for their ability to get along in society, and for their happiness and their well-being. The parent gets to choose the child, but this is not the case in the reverse. The child doesn't get to choose its parent. It's sort of stuck with the parent that it gets, for better or for worse. And as we are all probably aware of, there are situations in which the child gets the worst. But even more than the fact that this situation is unchosen and the child has no control over who their caretakers are going to be or who their parents are going to be, the child comes into the world in a uniquely vulnerable and powerless situation. It doesn't have the physical, emotional, or mental capacities to survive on its own. It depends on its caretakers and on its parents and on its broader community for everything that it will need to get along in the world. So this is clothes and foods, but this is also social knowledge, education, healthcare, the resources to pursue who they are, psychological adjustment, but probably most crucial of all, love and care. For everything that the child needs in order to survive, to get along socially, and to pursue what is of value to them, they will depend on their parents for years, for over a decade, perhaps 2 decades or more. They will depend on their child or they will depend on their parents in one way or another to help them get along, to teach them, to provide them with the things that they need not only to survive, but to succeed and to be happy. Because of this dependence, because of this power disparity, if the parent chooses to exploit this for their own narcissistic ends, if they use their child as an emotional object, if they use their child as a source of labor, if they abuse their child physically, mentally, or emotionally, the child has no recourse. The child can't really walk away. If you're in a relationship with an adult and they mistreat you, at the very least, you can walk away. At the very least, you can try to protect yourself. but the child can't. They can't walk away from their parents. They can't physically, mentally, emotionally resist what their parents tell them or how they treat them. And particularly if they're being abused, the only people who can help the child are other adults outside of the situation, not the child themselves. So even in the situation of self-protection, the child is uniquely dependent on on adults and on their caretakers. This means that it can be relatively easy for a parent to mistreat their child and get away with it. And it often means that the child must simply endure, put up with their mistreatment, and adapt themselves to the situation, mold their own self-conception, inhibit themselves, and simply deal with the kind of mistreatment that they're experiencing. This can even come about in subtle ways. When the parent is struggling with chronic depression or anger or anxiety, the child, because of the power dynamic involved, will naturally adapt themselves to the needs of the parents in order to receive love and care from them. They will subvert their own personality, their own sense of self, their own idea of what's going to make them happy in order to become whatever the parent needs them to become, and this to secure their love and care. And so mistreatment can come about in ways that are both overt and explicit, as well as subtle. And this can even extend beyond just the childhood stage. Teenagers as well are in a position where there is a significant power imbalance. There might be a bridging of the gap when it comes to physical power imbalance. The teenager can put up a fight if they need to, but still teenagers are dependent for resources to be able to survive in the world. There's very few teenagers who could sort of strike it out on their own and endure homelessness, for example, for the sake of getting away from their parents. They simply don't have that kind of independence. And not only that, they've only recently come out of the parent-child dynamic where the parent's intellectual and emotional power of the child was significant. And so they're still in this realm of training. If the parent mistreats them, even unintentionally, the teenager has a little recourse and little ability to explicitly push back within themselves against what the parent is doing against them. And so even in the case of teenagers, this power dynamic exists, admittedly to a lesser degree, but the same structure applies. The origin of this kind of power dynamic and the reasons why the child will conform themselves so much to the parents' demands for them, even if they're being mistreated, actually has its origins in a darker evolutionary story that I really can't get into here on YouTube, but which I've written about in an article on my Substack that I will link below if you are interested in the true origins of this power dynamic. But given the unchosen nature of the child's relationship with their parents, as well as the fact of the massive power imbalance between them, how can the parent approach their situation with their child in an ethically ideal way? How can they apply the principles of voluntarism and of authenticity in the raising of their children? Well, the first idea that we're going to look at is this idea of basic moral respect. I think in our everyday lives, when we are around other adults, this is easy for us to apply, right? We sort of just apply the golden rule of how would I want other people to treat me? When it comes to our adult to adult relationships, this is pretty intuitive. If you have a wife, you don't yell at her or put her in a corner because you might feel disrespected by her. If she doesn't do her chores around the house, you don't lock her in her room until you feel as though she's learned her lesson or take away her things. You have a sort of basic moral respect for her and a basic idea that she has, in one sense, a right to make mistakes, a right to be imperfect, a right to not live up to your idea of goodness. And that if she doesn't live up to that idea, you still don't have the right to use force or violence or threats or intimidation or coercion in order to make her live up to your ideal of what she should do or what she should be. And in the same way, when we're talking about our coworkers or our friends or just other adults in general, this same kind of moral intuition applies. We assume that they have a right not to live up to what our conceptions of the moral ideal would be. And we give them enough respect to not yell at them, to not use force and violence, to not intimidate or threaten them, in order to incentivize or teach them how to be our idea of a good person. But routinely, this kind of basic moral respect that we give to other adults who are in chosen relationships around us and who are not in an imbalanced power dynamic with us, that kind of basic moral respect that we give them is routinely violated in the parent-child relationship. Parents routinely use force and coercion and intimidation and threats in order to mold their children to their idea of what a good person is. So this would be things like yelling, timeouts, forced chores, spanking, threats of grounding, threats of taking away their property, manipulation, gaslighting, and even just sometimes straight up lying to them in order to manipulate them into doing what the parent wants them to do. All of these tactics would be considered absurd and horrible in relationships to the adults around you, even though those relationships are infinitely more chosen and the other person has infinitely more power to walk away if you mistreat them. And all these examples point to this principle of voluntarism. In the same way that we ought to give adults basic moral respect to make decisions about what they're going to pursue and what they're going to do and what they're going to value, and how we don't have a right to use force or violence or coercion or threats or intimidation against them in order to incentivize them, we should be bringing the same kind of basic moral respect to our children. And in fact, we should be more vigilant in the ways in which we might be doing this because of the situation of the child, because they're in such a vulnerable position, because they can't escape our mistreatment. They can't escape our force, our violence, our intimidation, our threats against them in order to get them to do what we want or what we expect of them, because they are so ready and willing to change and mold themselves to our expectations of them and suppress themselves, suppress their own authenticity, suppress their own values. If it's immoral to use force, violence, coercion, intimidation, or threats against an adult for the sake of what you think they should do, it is even worse to use these tactics against a child for the sake of what you think they should do. Now, I've often get the objection to this that, children are irrational, they're selfish, they're ignorant and naive. And so if we don't use force, violence, coercion, and intimidation to get them to do what we want, then they're going to act in terrible ways. And we'll get to the role of the mentor in the parent-child relationship. This is not an advocate to not parent or to not guide, but in terms of this charge that children are inherently selfish, naive, stupid, and that this means the parent must use force, violence, intimidation, coercion, and threats in order to teach them, I would like to point out that these same kinds of descriptions apply equally well, if not more, to the adults around us. It turns out that adults are selfish and stupid and ignorant and naive, but they are also immensely powerful, and they get to use that power often for the sake of doing really stupid, irrational, bad things, and things that we would judge as non-valuable, that we would say they shouldn't pursue. And yet, we still give them the freedom to act for the sake of these kinds of things, right? It's good for somebody to go to the gym regularly and eat healthy. And yet millions of Americans, millions of people around the world don't do these kinds of things. And we say that these people have the freedom to do exactly that. Now, this doesn't mean that you should enable your children to do things which you think might be harmful to them, but it does mean that you owe them the same kind of basic moral respect that you have towards adults towards them. The basic moral respect to refrain from force, violence, intimidation, coercion, and threats as a means of parenting your children. The one exception to this is if the child's life is in danger. Of course, in a situation like that, force is going to be necessary in order to protect them. If a child is going to run out into the middle of the street, you're going to use force to protect them from that naturally. But this is no different from how we would relate ourselves to adults. If a guy was about to accidentally step out in front of a beam that was falling from a construction site, you would grab him and pull him back, right? You wouldn't just sort of let the beam hit him and injure him. And yes, that would be an act of force, but it would be an act of force in order to protect them from immediate danger or harm. And of course, the same principle would apply to children. So this is not a call to never use force, especially when it comes to protecting the child from danger or from death. This is something that, of course, every parent is responsible to protect their child physically, but just because you are responsible to protect the child's life and protect them from physical harm does not mean that there is a blanket justification for using force, violence, intimidation, coercion, and threats to parent the child according to what your subjective expectations of them are. And again, this is just the basic moral respect that you already have towards other adults, towards your wife, your friends, your husband, your family, and applying it in a similar fashion to your relationship with your children. But of course, this isn't all that there is to parenting. Parents have a particular or peculiar responsibility to their children. And this is where we'll get into the idea of authenticity. The ideal here is something like a mentor. Think about the people in your life that have, guided you down the path, that have brought you to the place where you want to be, whether that's your career, whether that's your relationships, whether that's the spiritual realm, wherever it is in your life. You could probably name a couple of people in your life who guided you, gave you advice, gave you the resources that you needed, and gave you the insight that you needed to achieve the things that you wanted to do in your life. They set you down a path, or they opened your eyes to certain possibilities, or they gave you the resources that you needed in order to achieve your dreams, achieve the things that you've achieved in your life. This is the kind of relationship that a parent ought to have towards their child. A child comes into the world vulnerable. A child comes into the world without knowledge, without emotional maturity, without social understanding, without a great grasp of who they are and what they want and how to go about achieving it in their life. And it is the parent's responsibility to help them along this path, to teach them not only how to survive, how to get along in the world, but how to understand who they are and to help them to pursue it, to act for the sake of it, by giving them the knowledge and the skills that they themselves have developed in their life. This is the principle of guiding the child for the sake of their own authenticity. The parent has a unique responsibility to the child for this, to provide the things that the child's going to need and to guide them towards their own self-development, because the parent has voluntarily brought the child into the world. And because they have done this, now they become responsible for the child's well-being. And the child's well-being is wrapped up in his survival, in his ability to navigate socially, and in self-understanding and his self-development of his own authentic instincts. The parent is in the best position to do this for the child, not only because of their own experience and knowledge, but because of the trusted relationship that the parent has with the child. The fact that the child is so receptive to the parent's advice and wisdom and love and care, if done in the right way. So the question that you have, or the question you might bring to the case of the child when you're trying to live up to this extra responsibility is, what would I want to do for myself? How would I want to encourage myself? What knowledge and skills have I benefited from in my life? And how do they apply to what this child shows an interest in? How can I give them the opportunities to explore what it is that they value, whether that's martial arts or sports or art or writing or video games or socializing or whatever? Your role is to try to understand who the child is and to help them to understand who they are, and then give them the resources and the opportunities that they need to explore that and to act for the sake of it in the world. This is not the same thing as just giving them whatever they ask for or enabling them to do things which seem to be obviously dangerous, right? If your kid all the kid wants to do is sit around all day and eat Twinkies, you're not going to go to the store and buy them the Twinkies just because they say, this is what I want all the time, because you have enough knowledge and wisdom to know that sitting around eating Twinkies all the time isn't going to help them self-develop or get the resources and skills that they need in order to be successful in the world. But the important caveat here is that you shouldn't replace their own authentic self-exploration with your preconceived understanding of what success looks like. The things that I've pursued, like philosophy and writing and YouTube making, for example, are something which I've benefited from and which I place a lot of value in. But it wouldn't be right for me to try to preconceive and pre-impose these kinds of values onto my children, to try to turn them into a philosopher or turn them into a writer or turn them into a YouTuber. Rather, my role would be to try to understand who they are, help them to understand who they are, and then provide them with the resources and the skills necessary for doing that without enabling them to do things which are self-destructive. Not buying your kids Twinkies is not the same thing as using force or violence or coercion or intimidation or threats against them. Refraining from force is different from enabling them to do things which are self-destructive. And so what are the kinds of things that you would do for yourself as a child? What are the kinds of things that you would do for a person you were trying to mentor? What are the kinds of things that you do for yourself in order to explore who you are and what you want out of life and how to pursue those things? Bring that same kind of mentality to your child, because that is, again, a part of this responsibility to teach the child, to help them develop, to help them get along in the world, to help them survive, while at the same time refraining from force, violence, intimidation, threats, and coercion as the means to doing that. In essence, what you're doing is you are promoting the real authenticity of the child. You are helping them to understand who they are, what they want out of life, and setting them up to be able to pursue that as an adult by giving them the resources, the knowledge, the love, the nurture, and the care that you yourself would want. Now, one of the things that we have to address here is that people rarely live up to ethical ideals, right? Ethical ideals are something that we aim for. They're not something that we necessarily achieve, because people are imperfect. People make mistakes, and parents make mistakes. You can't have the expectation of yourself that you're never going to yell at your child, that you're never going to mistreat them either subconsciously or on purpose, that you're going to be a perfect parent who always refrains from force, who always morally respects your child, who always encourages them to be who they are. This is simply unrealistic, right? We don't even have this expectation when it comes to our relationships with adults. If you're in a marriage, there are going to be times when you mistreat your wife or your husband, where you do show them disrespect, where maybe you do yell at them or something happens like that. But just because a parent isn't perfect, it doesn't sort of relieve them from the moral responsibility, from the fact that they have made a mistake. And just like in a marriage, you're going to go to your partner and you're going to acknowledge that you've done something wrong. You're going to apologize to them for the mistake that you've made. You're going to promise to be better. Maybe you'll even tell them how. You're going to be vulnerable with them about what was going on from you. And you're going to be honest with them and curious about how they experience the things that you had done, right? So if you yell at your wife, you're going to go to her afterwards, once you've recognized that you've done something wrong, and say, "I'm sorry that I yelled at you. That must have been scary for you." You're going to be curious about what it was like for her. You're going to listen to her. You're going to apologize. You're going to be honest. And in turn, she is going to forgive you for that and give you grace, because she's as imperfect as you are. And this is the same kind of attitude that we ought to have towards our children. When we are imperfect as parents, when we mess up, when we yell, we use force, we use intimidation or coercion, we fail to live up to our responsibilities in order to help our child self-develop. We're selfish, we're self-concerned. We fail to be the kinds of parents that we ought to be. It's really important to go to our children and admit this honestly and openly, to be vulnerable and say to them, "Listen, I'm sorry I yelled at you. That was wrong of me. That must have been scary for you." And then to listen to what they have to say to that and to ask for their forgiveness. In the first place, this keeps your relationship with them authentic. This keeps your relationship with them grounded in reality, grounded in the fact that you are imperfect, that you are not a God among men who has all the answers and who will always treat them right, that you're a human being, and that that's okay, so long as you acknowledge this and you apologize and ask for forgiveness and really try to empathize and listen to the person that you've hurt. And so in the first place, it keeps your relationship with your child realistic and authentic, but it also does the work of teaching your child to do the same in relationship to the people around them. Because your child's going to make mistakes. Your child's going to be perfect, right? Your child's going to grow up as an adult and make mistakes with the people around you. Your child's going to mistreat you. They're going to be disrespectful to you. They're going to yell at you. They're going to act impulsively or irrationally. And if they have seen you model this with them, if they have seen you model apology and vulnerability, honesty, openness, forgiveness, if they've seen you model this, they will know that it's okay for them to mess up. It's okay for them to ask for an apology, or it's okay for them to apologize, to be vulnerable about their imperfections, to seek reconciliation, and to be curious and empathetic about the feelings of the person that they may have hurt, including you, which creates a real vital kind of relationship rather than a relationship where the parent is trying to present themselves as perfect and trying to present themselves as the moral authority, the unfailing moral authority over the child, which is simply unrealistic. You can be a guide, you can be a mentor, you can be a parent, you can be a loving and caring parent and also be an imperfect human being who acknowledges that. And that is actually healthy for your relationship with the child and healthy for the child's future relationships with other people as well as themselves. Next, I'll sort of briefly talk about two modes of parenting that really fail this standard of the ethical ideal. Again, everybody is imperfect, everybody makes mistakes, but these two modes of parenting are, in one sense, a different philosophy. They purposely take other principles and apply them to parenting, and I believe that both of these modes of parenting are ultimately failures to live up to the ethical ideal of parenting. The first one is probably the most obvious and probably the most outdated, which is authoritarian parenting. And this is the kind of parenting where the parent proudly embraces force, violence, coercion, and intimidation to mold their children in their own image of what the child ought to be. Instead of teaching the child the actual value of things like respect or work or self-development or self-understanding, they replace teaching for force. They replace guidance for intimidation. They say, you are going to do this thing that I have told you to do. You're going to clean the dishes. You're going to get A's on your homework. You're going to play nice with the other kids. And if you don't, I am going to hurt you in some way, whether that's physically, emotionally. I'm going to punish you in some deliberate way. They don't allow natural consequences to come about as a result of bad action, but they impose consequences, really impose some form of force, violence, intimidation, coercion, or threat on their children as the way of teaching them, which of course doesn't actually teach the child anything, but rather teaches the child that they should fear their parents, teaches the child that when they're around their parents, they should act one way, and when they're not around their parents, that's when they can get away with who they really are and what they really want and what they really value. It doesn't actually teach them the value of anything. It just teaches them to fear power. And so this authoritarian kind of parenting fails both of our tests. One, in the sense that it completely violates the basic moral respect that you would give any other human being in a far less exploitative situation. We don't use force, violence, coercion, and intimidation against other adults in our day-to-day interactions with them. We use voluntary means of interacting with them. Authoritarian parenting usurps this. Authoritarian parenting says because the child is powerless, because the child is sort of naturally bad, that the parent then has a right to use all of this to completely violate basic moral respect against the child for the sake of what they perceive is good, without acknowledging the fact that they themselves are not exactly good people either, that they themselves can be selfish and narcissistic and mistaken and wrong as well. And I think what's most ironic about this is that they wouldn't accept the same kind of behavior of the child against them. If the child used force, violence, intimidation, coercion, or threats against them in order to teach the parent something or impose their values on the parent would not accept this at all and double down on their own force, and violence and coercion. So because the power dynamic is so disproportionate between the parent and the child in this situation, the authoritarian parent exploits this to the maximum for the sake of their own preconceived ideas of what they think is good and right. They believe that simply because they are a parent, they have somehow gotten the right to violate conventional morality against their children, who are completely powerless against them to stop them. And they fail in terms of developing the child's authenticity because they impose their own values on them through this force and violence. They don't care about who the child is or what they want to be or what is of value to them. They're not interested in exploration. They're interested in domination. When they fail as parents, when they mess up, they don't acknowledge this. They gaslight the child. They blame the child. They make the child responsible for even their own problems. And so often they'll say something like, well, why did you make me hit you? Why did you make me yell at you? Why did you make me put you in a corner? You should just behave yourself. And so they make the child responsible even for their own immoral behavior. But the other end of this spectrum, the other failure mode of parenting here would be the permissive parent. So this is it might even be better to call this the enabling parent. This is the parent who they certainly refrain, perhaps, from using force, violence, or intimidation against their children, but they sort of just indulge the child in whatever instinctual wants that they have in an attempt essentially to avoid parenting altogether, avoiding the need of difficult conversations, difficult decisions, and just uncomfortable situations with their child in general. They sort of just give in to whatever the child demands of them. And the parent themselves become an object for the child's use. Now, this would violate any normal relationship between an adult and adult. If you were in a marriage with somebody or a friendship with somebody and they just used you all the time and they didn't consider you as a person, and every time they wanted something or they needed something, you just gave it to them uncritically, without conversation, without trying to understand what was going on, then you would essentially become this object for them. And most outside people would consider that to be a kind of a toxic relationship. But in the case of the permissive parent, it's even, or the enabling parent, it's even worse, because they have a responsibility to teach their child. They have a responsibility to help this child get along in society, survive, and become emotionally mature, and to understand who they are and to pursue it. And the permissive parent doesn't do the hard work of parenting at all. They just give the child whatever they want, whatever they instinctually want. And we all know that what you instinctually want in the moment is not representative of who you actually are, that who you actually are takes a process of discovery. And so, to the kid who just wants to sit on the couch and eat Twinkies all day, the parent will go out and just buy them Twinkies and not have a conversation with them, not give them incentives, not model their own behavior. They sort of just abandon the role of parenting to the bare necessity of what the child needs to survive and whatever instinctual wants that come up. This fails the basic moral respect that you would give anybody else. In adult relationships, you have to establish boundaries. You have to have a respect for the person enough to assert to them that you are a person as well, with thoughts, ideas, feelings, and needs. And that sometimes means that you have to make the people around you uncomfortable by having difficult conversations with them, by refusing to enable their behavior. If your friend is doing something that is very self-destructive, if they're drinking a lot, or they're taking drugs, or they're gambling, you don't help them by enabling that behavior, right? By buying them alcohol or drugs or giving them money to gamble with. And in the same way, this same enabling violates the moral relationship that you should have, the basic moral respect that you should have towards your child as a human being, in the sense that you shouldn't enable them towards destructive behaviors, and you need to be able to set boundaries with them as well, because you yourself are a person with wants, needs, and emotions. And that's the principal way that they learn to socialize, is the way in which they socialize with you. And so if you have a dramatically different, social relationship with your child than you would to an adult, in terms of enabling destructive behavior, you're already violating that basic moral respect. And then, of course, it completely fails to help the child develop authentically, because destructive instinctual behavior is only one part of who the child actually is. The real child, the whole child, is a collection of drives and desires and wants and needs, including an idea of the future. And the parent's responsibility is to help that child develop a holistic understanding of who they are and help them develop that while refusing to enable obviously destructive behaviors, but without recourse to force, violence, and coercion. So this parent gets it right in the sense that they're refusing to use force, violence, coercion, or threats, but they fail to live up to the actual ethical idea of, the sort of trusted mentor that helps the self-development of the child themselves. And this often comes out of a personal narcissism, a lack of a desire to parent in general. And I would say this kind of parenting is really only temporary. It tends to blow up into authoritarian parenting in moments. The parent will be sort of passive for a while and then blow up in anger and force and violence as a result of their own frustrations with their child. So it ends up devolving into authoritarian parenting anyway. But anyway, that's where we're going to end it. What are your thoughts? Did this video change your mind at all? Where do you think the line between guidance on the one hand and force on the other hand is in the raising of children? And do parents have a special right to use force against their children just because they're parents? A right they don't typically have against other adults? Put your thoughts down in the comments and I would love to go over that with you and talk to you guys more about it. But if you like this video, then please like it. If you think that somebody else could benefit from this video, please share it with them. And if you want more videos like this, then subscribe for more. In our next video, we're going to expand this examination of the parent-child relationship by relating it to the state citizenship connection. There's actually a parallel power dynamic that exists between the two, and we're going to explore that more in the next video. But as always, guys, thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.